Our story begins about 150 years after the legendary reign of Hammurabi, whose dynasty had held sway over Mesopotamia. But now, a new chapter unfolds as a mysterious group of newcomers appears on the scene. This era, from roughly 1560 BCE to around 1440 BCE, is often referred to as the Dark Ages due to the scarcity of written records. During this time, the established Semitic states, including the state of Ashur, found themselves overshadowed by the rising influence of newcomers like the Kassites and the Hurrians. While the Akkadian and Sumerian languages continued to thrive or make comebacks, the cuneiform script remained the dominant form of writing. One significant development was the emergence of new Semitic elites, particularly from the ranks of the priesthood and scribes, who gradually gained power and influence. The Kassites, an enigmatic group, initially settled in what is modern-day western Iran, specifically the Hamadan Kermanshah region, around 1800 BCE. Their presence began to be felt when Samsu-Luna had to fend off groups of Kassite invaders. Over time, more Kassites made their way to Babylonia and other parts of Mesopotamia, where they established their own principalities, though details about these states remain scant. Curiously, there are no preserved inscriptions or documents in the Kassite language, which adds to the mystery. However, around 300 Kassite words have been found in Babylonian documents. Their social structure and culture also remain largely elusive. We do know that they practiced polytheism, worshipping around 30 deities. The precise beginning of Kassite rule in Babylonia is difficult to pinpoint. However, a notable figure named Dagon II managed to reclaim the statue of the Babylonian god Marduk, which had been taken by the Hittites. He restored the cult of Marduk and elevated him to the same status as the Kassite god, Shakyamuni. While native princes continued to hold sway in southern Babylonia, it was possibly Alamburiash who finally annexed this territory around 1450 BCE. Diplomatic relations with Egypt and Syria began during this time, marking the start of Babylon's engagement with the wider world. A new capital named Dur-Kurgaltsu, located west of modern-day Baghdad, emerged as a rival to Babylon. Named after Kurgaltsu I, the subsequent rulers engaged in international diplomacy and trade, forging alliances and arranging political marriages. However, conflict with the Assyrians loomed, leading to the eventual defeat of Kurgaltsu II. During the reign of Kashtiliash IV, Babylonia found itself at war on two fronts, against Elam and Assyria. This ultimately resulted in the catastrophic invasion and destruction of Babylon by Tukulti-Ninurta I. It wasn't until the time of kings Adad-Shum-Usha and Melishapakt that Babylon enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. Yet, their successors faced new challenges, including the formidable King Shutruk-Nahant of Elam, whose cruelty and ferocity eventually led to the demise of the Kassite dynasty around 1155 BCE. The annals of this ancient civilization are filled with lamentations for their tragic fate. Around 1380 BCE, significant changes were afoot in Mesopotamia under the rule of the Kassites. The Kassite elite, although a minority, had undergone a process of Babylonianization. This meant that even among the royal class, Babylonian names became prevalent, and they held key positions in the civil service and the military. A feudal system began to take root, bearing the influence of the Kassites. In the bustling towns of Babylon, life was thriving once again, driven by commerce and skilled craftsmanship. However, in the rural areas, it was the Kassite nobility who held sway, owning vast expanses of land. Much of this land had been granted as royal gifts to deserving officials and civil servants, carrying significant privileges. To keep track of these extensive estates, especially after Kurgaltsu II's time, they were meticulously recorded on stone tablets known as kudaras. These boundary stones were adorned with intricate bas-relief pictures, often featuring numerous religious symbols and detailed inscriptions. These inscriptions outlined the boundaries of the estate, recorded the recipient's entitlements, and ominously cursed any trespassers. On these vast estates, the primary activities were agriculture and cattle husbandry, with a focus on breeding horses for the swift war chariots used by the cavalry. Horses and chariots were even exported in exchange for valuable raw materials. The kings, following the tradition of benevolent rulers, continued to champion social welfare. The decline of Babylonian culture, which had set in during the final years of the Old Babylonian period, persisted for some time into the Kassite era. It wasn't until approximately 1420 BCE that the Kassites began to shape a distinctive architectural and sculptural style. Kër-Galtsu-I played a pivotal role as a patron of the arts, particularly in Ur, where he supported architectural endeavors. In the realm of literature, poetry and scientific works started to flourish gradually after 1400 BCE. Even earlier works existed, evidenced by poetic compositions, philological lists, and collections of omens and signs, some dating back to the 14th century or earlier. These texts were discovered not just in Mesopotamia but as far away as Hattusa, the Hittite capital, Ugarit, in Syria, and Palestine. In the later years of the Kassite era, new writings emerged, including medical diagnoses, word lists, and astrological omens with interpretations. While many of these works survive only through later copies, one epic, known as Enuma Elish, stands out. It tells the tale of the god Marduk, who rose from a local deity of Babylon to become the ruler of all gods after vanquishing the forces of chaos. For nearly a millennium, Enuma Elish was recited during the Spring New Year's festival in Babylon as part of the Marduk cult. Interestingly, the literature of this time contains relatively few Kassite words. Many scholars believe that the foundations for the subsequent flourishing of Babylonian culture were laid during the later stages of the Kassite era. The weakening of the Semitic states in Mesopotamia after 1550 enabled the Hurrians to penetrate deeper into this region, where they founded numerous small states in the eastern parts of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. The Hurrians came from northwestern Iran, but until recently very little was known about their early history. After 1500, isolated dynasties appeared with Indo-Aryan names, but the significance of this is disputed. The presence of Old Indian technical terms in later records about horse breeding and the use of the names of Indian gods, such as, for example, Indra and Varuna, in some compacts of state formally led several scholars to assume that numerous groups of Aryans, closely related to the Indians, pushed into Anatolia from the northeast. They were also credited with the introduction of the light war chariot with spoked wheels. This conclusion, however, is by no means established fact. So far it has not been possible to appraise the numbers and the political and cultural influence of the Aryans in Anatolia and Mesopotamia relative to those of the Hurrians. Sometime after 1500 the kingdom of Mitanni arose near the sources of the Khabur River in Mesopotamia. Since no record or inscription of their kings has been unearthed, little is known about the development and history of the Mitanni kingdom before King Tushratta. The Mitanni Empire was known to the Egyptians under the name of Naharina, and Thutmose III fought frequently against it after 1460 BCE. By 1420 the domain of the Mitanni king Sostatar, Saushatar, stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to the northern Zagros Mountains, in western Iran, including Alalak, in northern Syria, as well as Nutsi, Kurukani, and Arabka. The northern boundary dividing Mitanni from the Hittites and the other Hurrian states was never fixed, even under Sostatar's successors Artatama I and Shatana II, who married their daughters to the pharaohs Thutmose IV in 1400 to 1390, and Amenhotep III in 1390 to 1353, Tushratta in 1365–1330, the son of Shatana, was able to maintain the kingdom he had inherited for many years. In his sometimes very long letters, one of them written in Hurrian, to Amenhotep III and Akhenaten in 1353 to 1336, he wrote about commerce, his desire for gold, and marriage. Weakened by internal strife, the Mitanni kingdom eventually became a pawn between the rising kingdoms of the Hittites and the Assyrians. The kingdom of Mitanni was a feudal state led by a warrior nobility of Aryan or Hurrian origin. Frequently horses were bred on their large landed estates. Documents and contract agreements in Syria often mention a chariot warrior caste that also constituted the social upper class in the cities. The aristocratic families usually received their landed property as an inalienable fief. Consequently, no documents on the selling of landed property are to be found in the great archives of Akkadian documents and letters discovered in Nutsi, near Kirkuk. The prohibition against selling landed property was often dodged. However, with a stratagem, the previous owner adopted a willing buyer against an appropriate sum of money. The The wealthy Lord Tiptiller was adopted almost 200 times, acquiring tremendous holdings of landed property in this way without interference by the local governmental authorities. He had gained his wealth through trade and commerce and through a productive two-field system of agriculture, in which each field was cultivated only once in 2 years. For a long time, Prince Shawwatshub was in charge of the royal governmental administration in the district capital. Sheep breeding was the basis for a woolen industry, and textiles collected by the palace were exported on a large scale. Society was highly structured in classes, ranks, and professions. The judiciary, patterned after the Babylonian model, was well organized. The documents place heavy emphasis on correct procedure. While direct native sources about the religious beliefs of the Hurrians in the Mitanni kingdom are scarce, we can glean much from related Hittite and Ugaritic myths. The Hurrians, like many ancient Middle Eastern cultures, had a diverse pantheon of gods. At the helm of this divine hierarchy was Chub, the weather god, who wielded immense power. In myths, Chub overthrew his father Kamabi, drawing a parallel to the Greek god Zeus's overthrow of Kronos. Chub's war chariot was drawn by the bull god Ceres, representing day, and Haris, representing night. Major sanctuaries dedicated to Chub could be found at Arapka, modern Kirkuk, and Halab, modern Aleppo, in Syria. In the east, his consort was the goddess of love and war, Shoshka, while in the west, it was the goddess Hebat, Hepit, who bore similarities to the Semitic Ishtar Astarte. Other deities, like the sun god Shimagi and the moon god Khushu, played significant roles, with Khushu's consort being Nikal, akin to the Sumerian deity Ningal. The Babylonian god of war and the underworld, Nergal, held particular importance. In northern Syria, records show veneration for the god of war Astapi and the goddess of oaths, Ishara, dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. In addition to these anthropomorphic deities, the Hurrians also revered impersonal forces such as heaven and earth, as well as spirits associated with mountains and rivers. Hurrian myths often emphasized the formidable aspects of these gods rather than their benevolent qualities. Their religious practices included rituals of sacrifice and other ceremonies, which shared similarities with neighboring cultures. Hittite Anatolia, for example, shares many Hurrian rituals. The Hurrians also had a rich tradition of magic and oracles, which played a significant role in their society. They built temples, although these structures were of modest size and likely influenced by local traditions. The deceased were probably buried outside of settlements. Artifacts like seals exhibited a distinctive preference for naturalistic representations, carrying on traditions from Babylonian and Assyrian cultures. Their ceramics featured finely drawn decorations, typically white on a dark background. Palaces, a hallmark of Mitanni culture, reflected the prominence of the royal family. These palaces, even in district capitals, were adorned with frescoes. Unfortunately, our knowledge of Mitanni arts and culture remains incomplete, as only a handful of Mitanni settlements have been unearthed in Mesopotamia. The story of Assyria's rise during the 2nd millennium BCE is shrouded in mystery. While we have limited information about northern Assyria, the southern capital, Ashur, holds a bit more historical record. The ancient lists of kings suggest that a single dynasty ruled Ashur from around 1600 BCE. We know the names of these kings, but details about their rule are scarce. Most of these rulers bore Akkadian names, indicating that their dominion was likely quite limited. Even during its prolonged association with the Mitanni kingdom, it seems Ashur retained a degree of autonomy. Situated near the border with Babylonia, Ashur cleverly played these powers off against Mitanni whenever possible. Diplomatic agreements were forged. Ashur III inked a border treaty with Babylonia around 1480 BCE, and Ashur-bel-Nishu did the same around 1405 BCE. Ashur-nadin-Ahituin, 1392 to 1383 BCE, managed to secure support from Egypt, which sent him a shipment of gold. However, Ashur-uballit I, 1354 to 1318 BCE, shifted the balance of power. Initially subject to King Tushratta of Mitanni, he later attacked Tushratta, possibly with the assistance of Suppiluliuma, one of the Hittites. His actions redrew the map of northeastern Mesopotamia, and Ashur-uballit crowned himself great king, enjoying equal relations with Egypt's monarch. This irked the king of Babylonia. Ashur-uballit was also the first to dub Assyria the land of Ashur, preferring this name over Subatu, which had derogatory connotations in Babylonia. He went a step further by inscribing his records in the refined Babylonian dialect, not just Assyrian. He cemented relations by marrying his daughter to a Babylonian, intervening vigorously when Kassite nobles murdered his grandson. Future generations regarded him as the true founder of the Assyrian Empire. His successor, Enlil-Nahari, continued to challenge Babylonia, while Arik-Den expanded westward, encountering Semitic tribes of the Aklamu group. Yet, the most significant strides were made by Adad-Nahari. He defeated the Kassite king Nazim-Arutash, compelling his retreat. Following this victory, he vanquished the Mitanni kings, Shatwara I and Wasashata. This enabled him to incorporate most of Mesopotamia into his empire, albeit temporarily, as later conflicts resulted in substantial losses to the Hittites. In the east, he focused on protecting his lands from mountain tribes. Adad-Nahari's inscriptions were more extensive than his predecessors and were penned in the Babylonian dialect. In these writings, he claimed divine summons to wage wars. He assumed the title of Great King and declared himself king of all. He invested in the development of Ashur, enhancing the city's temples, palace, and fortifications, especially along the Tigris River. Furthermore, he initiated substantial construction projects in the provinces. Shalmaneser I, son of Adad-Nahari I, ascended to power around 1263 BCE. His reign marked a period of expansion and military conquests for the Assyrian Empire. He set his sights on Urartu, a region in southern Armenia that had seemingly seceded. However, he faced a formidable adversary in Shatwara II of Hanagalbat, who cunningly cut off Shalmaneser's forces from their water sources. In a daring act born from desperation, the Assyrians fought their way out of this dire situation and then moved to subjugate the remnants of the Mitanni kingdom, converting it into an Assyrian province. Shalmaneser I boasted of blinding 14,400 enemies in one eye, employing psychological warfare tactics that would become more common in Assyrian campaigns. During this time, the Hittites and Babylonians, recognizing Assyria's growing power, attempted to halt its expansion through a prolonged commercial war. Shalmaneser, like his father, was a prolific builder. He strategically founded a second capital, Kalak, at the confluence of the Tigris and Great Zab rivers. His son, Tukulti-Ninurta, known in Greek legends as Ninus, was a gifted but extravagant ruler who elevated Assyria to a position of great influence. He conducted massive deportations of Hittites from eastern Anatolia and engaged in intense conflicts with Babylonia, even deporting Kashtiliash IV to Assyria. However, his actions took a sacrilegious turn when he looted Babylonian temples, a deed condemned even within Assyria. His relationship with his capital deteriorated to the point where he commenced the construction of a new city, Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta, on the opposite bank of the Tigris River. Eventually, his own sons rebelled against him, laying siege to his city, and he met a violent end. Despite his successful wars against Babylonia, the Assyrian Empire began to fragment after his death, while Babylonia's power surged. Assyria had endured oppression under the Hurrians and the Mitanni kingdom. Its struggle for liberation, followed by the ensuing conflicts, significantly contributed to its transformation into a military powerhouse. In Ashur, the capital, the king relied on the citizenry, the priesthood, and the landed nobility for the chariot troops. Documents and letters reveal the vital role of agriculture in Assyria's development. The state relied less on artificial irrigation compared to Babylonia. The breeding of horses was a thriving industry, with remnants of detailed training instructions still extant. Trade and commerce also played pivotal roles. Metals were imported from Anatolia and Armenia, tin from northwestern Iran, and lumber from the west. Often, the opening of new trade routes became both a cause and objective of warfare. Assyrian architecture evolved into a distinctive style blending Mitannian and Babylonian influences. Palaces boasted colorful wall decorations. The art of seal cutting, heavily influenced by Mitanni, continued to flourish. Scribes, who underwent training in schools, were proficient in both Babylonian and Assyrian dialects of the Akkadian language. Babylonian literature was assimilated into Assyrian, often adapted into new forms. Meanwhile, the Hurrian tradition persisted in military and political spheres, simultaneously influencing language vocabulary. Babylonian literature was assimilated into Assyrian, often adapted into new forms. Meanwhile, the Hurrian tradition persisted in military and political spheres, simultaneously influencing language vocabulary.